Hello, just wanted to say at the top of this video that this is in place of a weekly reads because I've only read 2 books this week and I've already done a solo review of one of them. So I figured that it would basically just be a solo review of the second book if I didn't do it. And it was one I was planning on doing a weekly read for anyway, a solo wrap up for anyway. So anyway, enjoy the video and take care. Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today continuing with reading books from the Women's Prize Shortlist this year 2022. I've just finished reading Meg Mason's Sorrow and Bliss. And I will be talking a little bit about some spoilers a little bit later into this, and because this is quite a plot heavy book in some ways, I sort of do kind of caution you around that I will be going into those, but I will announce that before it happens. But also I'll try and stick with this initial bit just about things that are kind of known from the off or like that are on the blurb, for example. Anyway, so this book was one of those ones on the shortlist that I kept on hearing about from people in quite varied ways. Some people absolutely adoring this, some people really strongly disliking it for several different reasons. And I think a big part of that as well is, you know, any book that deals with issues around mental health, many people have lived that in various forms, either themselves personally or in dealing with the mental ill health of a friend or relative. And so it strikes up, you know, it sort of sets up some fairly big emotions. You know, I kind of think that there's so much that's rich and important and interesting in this book, but I also do understand a lot of the criticism some people have of it. However, overall, I really enjoyed this. I thought this was a book I kind of went into somewhat unknowing. I'd seen a little bit about people loving it or hating it, but hadn't really paid too much attention to what the book is actually about. And ultimately, at the heart of it, we have a woman called Martha who is, in many ways, floating through her own life, seemingly kind of passive at times to everything that's going on, seemingly really struggling with a lot of things around her, but also really able to kind of find absolute gutter humour in laughing at some of the darkest moments. And I think that is what I would overall say I think is one of the book's real strengths, is this book is incredibly funny, even though the subject matter is dark, is very, very dark at times. And so I would kind of caution that if you are somebody who maybe does not, you know, would maybe struggle with sort of dealing with themes around mental health, and particularly quite in-depth discussions of it at times, I would maybe caution against it. But I think on the whole this book is incredibly funny and very human, and I'll talk a little bit about that bit first. So the non-spoiler bit first, and then I'll announce before some spoilers in a mo. So Martha is she has this very strong relationship with her sister, Ingrid. We are also told that there are these other different sort of parts of her life that are falling apart in some ways. So her relationships, a sort of desire around, does she want kids or does she not want kids? Various other family discussions are in there as well. She has a pretty supportive father. She has a mother who has her own history of illness, and there's a very difficult relationship there between those two women. I also think it's really interesting how this book slowly unfurls. So we get right from the beginning this sense that Martha is very almost sarcastically dealing with everything in her life. Humour is her coping strategy. She absolutely tears some things apart. One of her jobs is having a food column for Waitrose, which is a sort of fairly big upmarket supermarket in the UK. And she writes this sort of funny food column, which is largely just her being quite vicious at times, but in quite a funny way. And this book, I think, is set up in purpose to really maximize some of this humor as well. It sometimes is almost told in segments. Sometimes we'll get a 2-sentence like aside, sort of, you know, just sort of separated out on the page a bit, you know, with little stars above and below, or, you know, almost little set pieces that take you from one moment to the next in this book. And as a result, there are these very kind of funny comical asides next to some really dark moments, and the humor is sort of seen both as sort of a coping strategy, but also some form of self-delusion at times. It seems almost that this humor is so it is the thing that everybody applauds her for. You know, loads of people around her tell her that she's really funny, and that's how she gets this writing job, and that's how she makes some of her friends, and her partners seem to really enjoy that. But that humour is also a thing that it's sort of the last vestige that she's hanging on to at times, or she's not even necessarily aware that she's being so funny. And so I think that overall really adds to the sort of deep layers of this book, that we are allowed as an audience to laugh, but then we go right back to some of the most horrendous things that are going on in this woman's life, and we sort of have to hope that there's another moment of humour coming. Another kind of key sort of thing to mention before we go into spoilers is just that this book deals with mental health in quite an interesting way, and I don't want to. I'll talk about this more in the spoilers, but it purposely never announces what mental health diagnosis Martha, the main character, has, and that I think has been part of the criticism. Some people saying it's so generic that it sort of maybe stigmatizes all mental health issues in one, but also for other people that there's actually quite a brave move for an author to say, and actually in an interview that's at the back of this book, Meg Mason talks about it, that the idea would be that as soon as you give a character a label of they have X diagnosis, that might define them in the book. That, you know, all of the cover notes around the book will talk about this character with this diagnosis or representation for this mental illness, and that kind of is a big part of the book as well, as a sort of around having those conversations around it. And with that, I'm going to head into some spoiler territory because it's really hard to discuss much in this book without going into spoilers, and I'll do that in just a sec, so feel free to click away if you need to. So throughout the course of the book, Martha ends up in a couple of quite significant relationships with men, one of which is a marriage that is not going particularly well, or, you know, basically ends very soon after the wedding itself. And there is another marriage that is sort of with a childhood sweetheart, Patrick, and it fades. Is it Patrick? Yes. And it fades very quickly. Well, it lasts, but it's a difficult relationship between the two characters. And part of the reason around it, and part of the sort of discussion in the book, is that Martha herself seems to almost eject herself from her own life at times. She is so keen to try and do you know, to kind of just leave situations that she's not very comfortable with, or not have difficult conversations, or run away from things, or just sort of give up at various moments. And it just has these sort of long-term cumulative effects on her throughout the book, because there are moments where, you know, she's given up on something again, and this feels like a pattern. And there are just all of these really complicated moments within the book for her. And a big part of that focuses on having children and motherhood more generally. Does she want to be a mother? Does she not? And she ultimately makes the decision, well, she doesn't. She talks quite a lot throughout the book about how much she hates children, how much she could never bear the idea of it. But the book eventually sort of starts going into more of a discussion about maybe she did all along. She's just terrified about what she might be like as a mother, or maybe about some other factors around motherhood for her. And this sets up this really interesting discussion about how women are often treated in society. By her being a woman who, for all intents and purposes, keeps telling everybody that she doesn't want kids, she is sort of seen as an outcast and sort of pushed aside at times, whereas her sister Ingrid has there's almost this kind of constantly updating discussion around her about how at one point she has 2 kids who are under 3 years old, then it's 3 kids who are under 5 years old, and then eventually she has 4 kids under 9 years old. And there's almost this sort of this ongoing joke behind it, that this that Ingrid is just absolutely exhausted because of all these kids, but also, that Ingrid therefore has almost become like the better sister or the better woman, in very, very heavy quotations, in the sense that Ingrid has done more of what is seen as a form of success, again in inverted commas, for women, that she has successfully had kids, and therefore she is doing the mother thing. She's being, she's sort of feted and celebrated and all of these things, whereas Martha is struggling in her job, is sort of moving every so often, is really struggling with her mental health, and does not have kids. And these things almost seem to compound each other, that they all interact in quite a weird way. And I also think, kind of going back to that idea of the diagnosis of her mental health, of Martha's mental health being left blank, I think this again is quite an interesting and bold thing within the book, that it sets it up that we actually see what's happening as, there's almost a fear that comes with certain words. It actually weirdly reminded me a bit of the TV show Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, where at one point the main character in that, Rebecca Bunch, is, this is a slight tangent but it's going somewhere, is trying to find a diagnosis for her mental health, and she starts fixating on key terms and sort of being like, well, if I'm this, if I'm bipolar, this means I'm this. And there's almost something so prescribed that she feels that would take over if that is true. And so part of what comes up in Sorrow and Bliss is this idea that to give a label of a mental health diagnosis can sometimes feel that does a lot of work in other people's minds at telling somebody who somebody is. Now, I'm not here to get into the ins and outs of diagnoses and all of those sorts of things, but it is an interesting point that's raised, that although naming something can really help in terms of making sure you get the right support and everything else, there is a stigma that comes with certain diagnoses, and so to be called a certain thing is in itself sometimes limiting to some people, at least in the eyes of others. So there's a really interesting discussion that comes up about that, because she knows what this diagnosis is, but we don't as a reader. So she will say, I can't believe I was diagnosed with dash dash. How did mum hide this from me? And it becomes actually more of a discussion that this has been hidden within a family. This is a very loosely kept secret in some ways across the family, but it's always been hidden from her. There's always been an assumption that she would find out one day, or that it's maybe not the most useful thing to tell her right now. And so in the midst of all of this, we've just got a woman who is really trapped between so many parts of her own life. There's a lot that she blames herself for. She sees her own actions as really leading to a lot of this. But there are also so many of her actions that seem to have been driven by sort of her mental health and mental ill health especially, that she often can't necessarily summon the energy to go and change parts of her life, or there's a sort of fatalism around changing some parts of her life that she can't quite get over, even to the point where, for example, she takes her wedding dress to a charity shop and just tries giving it over, not selling it, not doing anything else. This woman at the charity shop is trying to sort of say, no, like, at least take it home in this nice fancy box, and she resists and just runs away. And so much of her life feels like it involves running away. And actually, that's what I think this book does really successfully, is navigate what it looks like when you keep running away, but also at the end she comes home. There's a sense of everybody coming together and things being a little bit better. Ultimately, this is a fairly hopeful book, despite the fact that it is incredibly sad and incredibly dark at times. There is always humour to be found, but there's always togetherness and belonging to be found as well. And that's how this book ends, with this real sort of triumphant sense of things slowly getting better. And yeah, so I really enjoyed this book overall. I think at times the jumps in time I found a bit jarring. But that was probably more me as a reader, I think, than the book, because I think it's been a hard week for me in terms of reading, because it's just been a hard week. So this has been a really sort of interesting book to be reading in amongst all of that. And yeah, I hope that you enjoy it if you have read it. I'd really love to hear people's thoughts, particularly around the representation of mental health and mental ill health in the book. But yeah, I've been Bob the Booker talking about this book. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.